In this episode of Shadows of Theory, we'll be looking at Fredric Jameson's concept of a political unconscious and how it relates to superhero films. Now, the political unconscious refers to the sort of cultural expressions that reflect our hidden drives, anxieties, and wishes, but our hidden drives, anxieties, and wishes and desires around our economic system. Okay? So, for example, an economic system can generate certain anxieties. I would argue, and in fact, we're experiencing certain anxieties around climate change, for example, and whether or not the capitalist economic system is able to cope with climate change and to further avert catastrophes. Now, I would argue that superhero films very often explore this themes. If you notice, apocalypses appear all the time in superhero films, and you might think of an expression popularized by the philosopher Mark Fisher and as well as the philosopher Slavoj Žižek, which goes that it's easier to imagine the end of a world than to imagine the end of capitalism. And in a similar vein, we can say that very often superheroes in superhero films seldom actually save the world entirely. They prevent an apocalypse, but then there's always a new one around the corner. And they never fix the underlying issue of what's causing these problems in the first place. Have you noticed that often, although admittedly not always, but often, superheroes actually aren't the protagonists? It's often the villains who want to change the world, whereas the superheroes want to maintain the status quo. Indeed, it's the villains who want to radically transform the world and the situation they find themselves in. Indeed, many have noted how the criminals who take over Gotham in The Dark Knight Rises resemble the Occupy movement. Indeed, Bruce Wayne is shown to be an ethical capitalist who only seems to enjoy luxury and decadence. In reality, he tries to make the world better. So basically, the film is demonizing the Occupy movement, while at the same time, it's trying to make you sympathize with the rich. The rich may seem like assholes, claims the film, but really, they donate to charity and they're saving the world. Indeed, notice how the bad guys aren't just the occupiers, but also the ecologists like Talia al Ghul. Other Batman media has form in this department. I mean, look at the villain Poison Ivy, who is kind of a wacky caricature of the environmentalist. Ivy is concerned with plant agency and stands in for all those whiny greenies going on and on and on about non-human forms of agency. And we see the environmental movement caricatured in other films as well, from even different franchises. So, for example, Thanos can kind of be seen as a caricature of an environmentalist who hates humanity, who hates life. You know, he sounds a little bit like a deep ecologist. I'm not saying that the Marvel films aren't, in some ways, exploring complexities to these issues, or indeed that the DC films aren't either. You might sympathize with Thanos. Indeed, Thanos is relatable because we see that he is capable of love, that he is an idealist. But in reality, though, Thanos isn't really a leftist. He isn't even a deep ecologist. Thanos doesn't attack capitalism or corporations, but instead, he kills half of all life across the universe. I mean, he could have just visited Wakanda and willed more vibranium. The closest we get to a Marvel film with genuinely emancipatory politics is Black Panther, where we see a utopian world separate to the West, capable of avoiding the pitfalls of capitalism and being technologically advanced, while also ecologically sustainable. But even then, Killmonger, although sympathetically portrayed, is kind of like a caricature of the left.
You know where I'm from. When black folks started revolutions, they never had the firepower or the resources to fight their oppressors.
He argues for a sort of permanent revolution.
We got spies embedded in every nation on Earth, already in place. I know how colonizers think. So we're gonna use their own strategy against them.
And maintains that the oppressed should take power. In short, he's kind of a stand-in for a socialist.
They'll arm oppressed people all over the world so they can finally rise up and kill those in power.
Note how even his name, though, suggests he's a fanatic, Killmonger. And for scarification on his body, although meant to resemble tribal custom, is also meant to indicate that he is unhinged. I've seen people online even argue that T'Challa, the Black Panther, ultimately embraces Killmonger's position, but really, if anything, T'Challa is closer to Hillary Clinton with a sort of nepotistic claim on leadership. And T'Challa, even when he embraces some of the ideas of Killmonger, what he really embraces is liberal interventionism. He doesn't embrace any sort of concept of permanent revolution. Instead, he favors humanitarian aid.
I bought this building. And that building. And that one over there. This will be the first Wakandan International Outreach Center. Now, Kia will oversee the social outreach. You will spearhead the science and information exchange.
You're kidding.
Yeah?
Even though a film like Black Panther offers a great sort of Afro-futurist utopian vision of an ecologically sustainable world, it nevertheless still portrays, for CIA in a positive light, and it still posits that we don't need revolution per se, we just need elites who understand the importance of charity. Now, I'm not trying to take away from the film. It's a fantastic film. It's imaginative, and importantly, Black Panther offers a utopian vision, one which addresses concerns around ecology. But nevertheless, I think it's curious that there has been this spate and a popularity around superhero films that will often concern serious issues, but also offer escapism. Another concern we often find in superheroes is, of course, the concern of terrorism and the trauma of September 11, which understandably still lingers. In many ways, I think, we start to see the popularity of superhero films come into a context of that sort of escapism and that need to both address this trauma, but also in some sense reinforce an idea of protection. A theorist like Mark Fisher or even Fredric Jameson might argue that part of the reason we've turned towards superhero films is because of anxiety. We want to regress to a childhood state because the problems around capitalism are so great that we simply don't have an answer. We're experiencing a sort of cultural stasis where more and more capitalism recycles its own products, recycles and reuses, and that's why we keep seeing sequels all the time. That's why we keep seeing extended universes. There's nothing new in our economic system, and so there's no real new products, new cultural products being produced. Everything's an adaptation of what's come before. Now, I should, of course, note that there are exceptions and TV programs like The Boys, which actually critique our obsessions with superheroes. And I love The Boys. I think it's a very good TV show, right? And you should definitely watch it. So I'm not saying that superhero media can never critique capitalism or pose an alternative to capitalism. Indeed, very often superhero films will even have the capitalist as a bad guy. But ultimately DC and Marvel movies often don't critique capitalism in a substantial way, right? Because they're films and films rely on stories, they have to personalize the problems of capitalism, right? And very often they'll find ways to suggest that capitalism doesn't need to change. people need to change. Now, at this point, I want to add there's no problem if you enjoy these films, and I'm not saying there isn't any merit in them or that you should give up watching these films. In fact, in many ways, they allow us to explore our anxieties in a comforting way, often in a cartoonish or hyperbolic way. They're very fun, right? And, I'm not saying that there's no merit to these films, right? But I do think that these films very often reflect not so much conscious propaganda as reflect our unconscious anxieties around our economic system, as well as our wish fulfillment that superheroes would just come in and save us from the left, who keep reminding us of these problems that we're facing with capitalism and with the environment and so on, right? So I think in many ways, superhero films are both wish fulfillment, but they also, in a sense, give expression to the anxieties that we're grappling with right now.